And God restored the fortunes of Job. And God restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends. And God gave Job twice as much as he had had before. Hear what the Spirit is saying to God's people. You may be seated. Earlier this week, while making breakfast for my kids, my partner Kiana uttered perhaps the most loaded phrase in perhaps the most loaded tone with the most loaded facial expression I've experienced in quite a long time. Now, the phrase and the tone combined with the expression stopped me in my tracks and made me lose all track of the amount of milk I was pouring in my son's cereal. The phrase was, quote, "Hey, have you looked at the bank account this morning?" Now, I'm not as good of an actor as many of you in this room, so let me just say clearly, I knew that a mysterious amount had definitely not been deposited into our account. I pulled it up, I took a deep breath to see that not only had our entire account been entirely wiped out, but we actually had a balance of negative $16,000. Whew. Now, after assuring my wife that this outcome was not a result of me buying World Series tickets, by the way, y'all pray for my Yankees. Pray. Y'all gonna pray for my Yankees? Are those prayers for the Yankees? Okay. Those don't sound like prayers. It's worth a shot. Erica, I know you're praying. But as we scrolled down, we knew instantly that one of our creditors had simply made a huge mistake. We called the bank sorted it out, and within 48 hours, the bank restored our fortunes. And please know, I'm taking great liberty with the term fortune. Beloved, if only God worked as efficiently as the bank. Because the story and the final chapter of Job makes us beg the question, even if it doesn't happen within 48 hours, and even if it isn't neat and tidy, nonetheless, we're asked to wonder, is God in the business of restoring fortunes? Is God in the business of setting the record straight? Does God examine our overdrawn accounts and the overdrawn accounts all over society and conclude, yes, this should not have happened. This is a great injustice. Check your account. What you lost will be restored in the morning. Can God be trusted to restore our fortunes? That is one of the questions that I believe the book of Job invites us to wrestle with this morning, especially with this ending. Beloved, there's a lot of abject suffering in the book of Job that brings into question not only God's sovereignty, but also God's goodness. But regardless of what's in the middle of this movie, the ending of the movie wants us to believe that regardless of what happened in the beginning and in the middle, that in the end, God sits on the top of the earth, as Job says, and God is still God, and God is still good, and God still can and will restore our fortunes. Because there are so many wild things happening in Job. Let's just be honest, y'all. Job is a wild book. It can be easy to miss that final point of the movie. It's a wild book with a lot of wild things happening, but it's also a book of wisdom. As a matter of fact, it is noted that Job is from the land of Uz, which is translated in Hebrew as counsel or advice. So though Job is pretty wild, it's also pretty wise. Matter of fact, look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, the book of Job is pretty wild, but it's also pretty wise. But beloved, we can get lost in whether or not this is a story about a real person. I believe that's besides the point. The wisdom of Job still preaches the same. Besides, the story of Job could never be made up because the story of Job is made up of all the stories of us. For we have all suffered. We have all encountered a life that makes no sense. We have all encountered a God that sometimes makes no sense. So make no mistake, even if we don't believe Job is real, Job could never be make-believe. Whether Job walked the earth or not, Job is based on a true story because Job is based on the human story, on our story. We can get lost in why is Satan talking to God like they're homies at Shake Shack? Which, I'm sorry for all of us Southern Californians, it's the superior burger to In-N-Out. I'm just saying. All right, thank you. All right, well, some boos. These don't sound like prayers this morning. We can get lost in that reality and that fact. But in the Hebrew mind, beloved, Satan was often seen as a servant of God who sifted and tested God's people and brought out the best in them. The version of Satan in the Christian scriptures evolves to become the embodiment of all evil. But that's not how the Hebrew mind would have thought about this figure in Job. Satan may have been a crafty trickster, but he wasn't quite yet evil personified. We can get lost in the seemingly ridiculous sequence of calamities. We can get lost in the seemingly ridiculous sequence of blessings. But beloved, I propose to you this morning that the point above all points that the author of Job is asking us to wrestle with is that when the stuff hits the fan, even if God is thought to be the one who threw it against the fan or allowed it to be thrown, regardless of how it got to the fan, when it hits the fan, is God the kind of God that will bend down and get in the mess and help make meaning of it? And we've got someone who has an answer in the back. Right. All righty. I'm just going to let this play out. I'm interested to see how this ends. All right. Okay, we got. Blessing of the animals was last month. I think we missed our. Will God get in the mess and help us make meaning of the mess? Or are we left to ourselves? Will God restore our fortunes? Or as it was asked in The Lord of the Rings, is everything sad going to come untrue? Will God and can God make everything sad come untrue? Beloved, I think that's what Job wants to leave us with. And like with so many questions in life that okay, so my wife just texted me. It came up on my iPad. Why you out here preaching, telling all our business? So just wow. All right. Well, thanks for watching, babe. Thanks for watching. All right. is a very interactive sermon. I thought I had this on Do Not Disturb, but I'm clearly being disturbed. I'm sorry, y'all. That threw me off. All righty. Okay. Will God and can God make everything sad come untrue? And like with so many questions in life, the answer, beloved, I think the answer depends on who you ask. Let's look at the psalmist of Psalm 34 and ask the psalmist of Psalm 34, does God restore our fortunes? Let's see what they think. The psalmist says this, my soul will boast about our God. Let the oppressed hear it and be glad. The poor call out, our God heard and saved them from all their troubles. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Happiness comes to those who take refuge in our God, but haters of justice will be condemned. Okay, the psalmist sounds convinced that not only does God restore fortunes, but God gets in the mess and does something about it, specifically on behalf of the oppressed, specifically on the behalf of the poor, specifically on behalf of the downtrodden and those in need of justice. The psalmist is convinced that regardless of what happened in the beginning or the middle of the movie, the end of the movie will have the oppressed restored, repaired, and redeemed. The psalmist is convinced that yes, God does and God can restore our fortunes. The psalmist's emphasis on the oppressed also helps us understand Job. For Job, beloved, translated in Hebrew, actually means persecuted or hated. So could it be, friends, that Job isn't just a story of profound individual suffering, but Job is also a story of profound communal suffering? Could it be that Job also represents the hated and the persecuted all over this world? As a matter of fact, liberation theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, who this past week went on to eternal rest, said that indeed Job is not just an individual, but there are also collective and communal Jobs all over this world. So with that being said, let's not just ask the psalmist this morning, but with that premise, it would also be fitting to ask a Palestinian this morning. Beloved, I wonder what our Palestinian siblings would say to the ending of Job and to the psalm and to the question, does God restore fortunes, as they, particularly in Gaza, are in the middle of what is not a movie, but a genocide. Maybe in Gaza and the West Bank and for the entire Palestinian diaspora, Job's ending can only be a prayer this morning. God, please restore our fortunes. God, please may the bombs stop falling. God, please may our children live to see a future. God, please may fathers and mothers cease to be taken from their children. Simply, God, please. And our Jewish siblings who have endured anti-Semitism for generations, many of whom, by the way, here in the U.S. and globally, and many Jewish Israelis are standing valiantly for a ceasefire and justice for the Palestinian people. But our Jewish siblings endured generations of anti-Semitism and the horror of the Holocaust. Now on the world stage have an army in the name of their own protection and safety, carrying out the same devastation and trauma that they themselves have so horrendously endured. As a matter of fact, Rabbi Robin Podolsky, who was with us here at All Saints Church last year and who is the Los Angeles program manager for At the Well, a nonprofit agency enhancing the spiritual well-being of women and non-binary people through Jewish wisdom, says it this way. She says, speaking on the unfolding genocide, quote, "What is my prayer? The founders of the state of Israel wanted, after years of exile and oppression, to create a normal country, a state just like the ones in which we suffered. I'm afraid that they have succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. I pray that we turn from this path, make a ceasefire now, and help the children to heal." End quote. Amen indeed. What is my prayer? Maybe Job's ending curls itself into a prayer on the lips of the marginalized. Maybe the distance between Job having more than before and what our Palestinian siblings have now and what the Jobs all over this world have now can only be closed by hope, can only be closed by prayer, can only be closed by asking God, please let the bombs stop falling. But I wonder, would the hated and persecuted all over this world find comfort in the ending of Job? Does God really restore fortunes? Does God really get in the mess? Can God really make everything sad come untrue? And I know, as a preacher, I hope, but I think you might be a little confused. Hopefully not by my sermon structure, but as a preacher, I'm supposed to give you a little bit more certainty than I'm giving you right now. But beloved, walking with God, and this is good news for someone in the house, because if you're anything like me, you aren't feeling too certain these days. But the good news is, beloved, walking with God does not require certainty. Walking with God only requires faith. And for something to be faith, that actually requires doubt, and that actually requires shaking, and that actually requires trembling and wondering if what God says the end of the movie will actually be the end, and if the end will actually be sweet enough to overcome the bitterness of the middle. Beloved, faith and walking with God does not require our certainty. It's okay if you walked into this space this morning a little bit uncertain, because so did I. I know some of us right now are in the bitterness of the middle, or have been in the bitterness of the middle, or will be in the bitterness of the middle at some point in our lives. The bitterness of the diagnosis, the bitterness of the abuse, the bitterness of the betrayal, the bitterness of the grief, the bitterness of the addiction, the bitterness of another election that sends shockwaves of dread through our bodies, the bitterness of the middle. And beloved, that's actually where we meet Bartimaeus this morning. In the gospel, we meet Bartimaeus in the middle of his lament, in the middle of the roadside. And beloved, if we ask Bartimaeus the question this morning, does God restore our fortunes? Bartimaeus would take the mic and say, I don't know about you, but I once was blind and now I see. I once was bound, but now I'm free. He would say there was a man from Nazareth who was on his way to Jericho, and I wasn't even on the agenda, but he stopped the agenda and asked me what I wanted done. And this man from Nazareth named Jesus opened my eyes. In spite of the crowd, wanting him to move on. And he heard my cry, and he didn't pass me by. And I'm standing here as a witness that Jesus will stop for you, even if you're pushed to the margins of the roadside. And yes, Jesus will restore, repair, and redeem. God does restore our fortunes. I wonder if we ask Jesus himself, what would Jesus himself say? Jesus, talk about the living embodiment of the name Job. Jesus, hated and persecuted by empire. Jesus, hated and persecuted by certain members of the religious establishment. And the combination of empire and religion have Jesus executed by the state by way of crucifixion. They hung him on the cross. He stretched his arms out wide. He bled and died. They placed him in the tomb, and he was in the tomb all night Friday, all day Saturday, but early Sunday morning, God restored his fortunes, because on the third day he rose again in accordance with the scriptures, and he ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father, and he will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. I wonder if Jesus would tell the story of the bitterness of his own middle and the sweetness of his own ending. Now, beloved, as I close, in asking the psalmist and in asking Bartimaeus and in asking Jesus, there's still one person left to ask. We still have to ask ourselves, with all the messy middles that we have brought into this space. And that's good news, because we can bring all of that into this space. Amen. It's good news. If you are a hot mess on a good day, that is good news today. Am I the only one? Don't raise your hand, just blink. As a matter of fact, I love that we say here at All Saints Church that God dwells in you. God dwells in you. And then you're supposed to say it back. And also in you. And I had a friend of mine say this, that we typically think that God dwells in us the way a person dwells in a house. Right? You're in one room and then you're in this room. But she said something so profound the other day. She said that actually, what if God dwells in us the way flour dwells in a cake? Where you can't tell where the flour begins and the cake ends. I'd like to imagine that that is actually how God dwells in us, in the middle of our mess. We can't tell where God begins and where we end, because there's no corner or space or area of grief, loss, or tumult that God stays away from. God is all up in our mess. And as incredible as a cake tastes, if you think about it, a cake is just a hot mess. Oh, that was good news for somebody this morning. That's all a cake is. It's just a hot mess. But we still got to ask ourselves. You see, what Job really exposes in us is the difference between knowing about God and knowing God. Job exposes the difference between wondering about God and walking with God. Job exposes the difference between talking about God and talking to God. And Job confronts us and haunts us and asks us to actually go deep within ourselves and to ask ourselves not what the priest says, not what the Episcopal Church says, not what our theological and philosophical resources, as important as they are, say, but through the suffering and messiness of this life, Job forces us to ask the question, what do I say? Who is God to me? Can God make everything sad come untrue? Who is God to me? There is in every person an inward sea. And in that sea, there is an island. And on that island, there is an altar. And standing guard before that altar is the angel with the flaming sword. And nothing can get by that angel to be placed upon that altar unless it has the mark of our inner authority. Nothing passes the angel with the flaming sword to be placed upon our altar unless it be part of the fluid area of our consent. This is our crucial link with the eternal. Howard Thurman. And God restored the fortunes of Job. What do you think? What do you think? Does God and can God do that for the Jobs all over this world? Can God do that for Palestine? Can God do that for our LGBTQ plus siblings in America? Can God do that for black people in America? Can God do that for the oppressed and the marginalized all throughout our nation? And can God do that for you? Amen.